Hello, beautiful people. My name's Emma.
And I'm MC.
And we are your hosts of the G-Forces podcast. So today was the Monaco Grand Prix, and I believe technically currently is supposed to be the Indy 500 happening right now, but I believe there was a rain delay, and we actually cannot watch it. And we realized that in the middle of the Monaco Grand Prix, I took a look, and we don't have cable, and we also don't have Peacock Premium, so we can't watch it. Which is kind of depressing, but...
I wonder if we'll be able to watch it, like, tomorrow, if it'll be available, so we'll definitely check that out.
I hope so.
If not, we'll find some race highlights and...
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure that there will be something somewhere that's streaming it that we can watch.
Yeah. No, it's definitely frustrating, but, I mean, the Monaco Grand Prix alone was delayed 40 minutes, not for rain and weather, but... I mean, that already pushed back our morning, so it's okay.
It's been a long day already. Mm-hmm. But, hey, it's been a really good weekend, I think, overall. So we are going to have a normal Grand Prix recap episode. So let's get into it.
So the official race name this weekend is Nice, Sweet, and Short, and... honestly, I like that it's not filled with sponsors. But the official race name for this weekend was the Formula One Grand Prix de Monaco 2024. This is round 8 of the 2024 season, and the track they're at is the Circuit de Monaco. So for those that aren't familiar or that didn't listen to our last episode where we did a rundown on kind of like the history of the Monaco Grand Prix along with IndyCar, this is a street race. It is one of, if not the shortest races of the season, and it is known for its tight, slow corners. There is little to no passing that will happen this weekend. The first Grand Prix was in 1950, the inaugural F1 year, but racing started in Monaco in 1929. The circuit length is 3.337 kilometers or 2.07 miles, so that means they're going to be doing 78 laps. So it is a higher lap count than we've seen all season. We've been like high 50s, low 60s. There's 19 turns on this track, and the race distance in total is 260.286 kilometers or 161.73 miles. The lap record was placed in 2021, and it is still held today by Lewis Hamilton, who was at Mercedes at the time, obviously. And he did the lap in 1 minute and 12.909 seconds. So we got some really, really fast laps. You can kind of see in that time alone that the circuit is short.
I think that was a lot faster than even the fastest lap from today.
It was. It was about 2 seconds faster, I believe. So, crazy. Who knows what the wind was like, what the weather, what the conditions. So, there's only one DRS zone at this circuit, which, you know, me and Emma talked about a lot. DRS is there to help with the battles, help with people passing. That's the reason why it was introduced into the sport. So while there is a DRS zone, it really doesn't add a lot.
You don't even notice it, honestly, because it's such a tight track that passing anyone is nearly impossible. I think we saw like 2 overtakes today, honestly. Like there was barely anything. I think it's more of a strategy game, and like we said in our last episode, qualifying is the most important thing in this race.
Yeah. So there is one DRS zone, and that is the detection zone starts at turn 17, and activation begins after turn 19 in that start-finish straight. So it's there. It's kind of in a typical place that we see DRS zones, but not really.
I think I saw one driver use it, and it was Max when he was lapping someone.
I mean, people
that was
were
it.
definitely in DRS range. Like, it was apparent throughout the race for a lot of people, especially with the way everyone was clumped together in their
I just
little
never really
section.
noticed it
But
taking
yeah,
an effect
again,
on
well, and I
anyone's
think
race.
it's something that the pundits and, like, the teams will talk about, and this wasn't really...
Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't think they mentioned it, like, once.
Yeah, so that is the race rundown. So...
All right, we're going to get into practice.
Yeah.
I think the main thing for all three practices were really people just trying to figure out the track. I know a lot of the drivers have raced here before, whether it was in F2 or F1, but I feel like practice is really just how can I get a good line without hitting the wall, because a lot of the turns if you take it ever so slightly wide, you're going to skim the wall or lightly tap it, and I think that it's not the most challenging course in the sense that you have to overtake and it's going to be an intense race, but it is I think, mentally challenging course, because if you are off by even a slight centimeter, you're in the wall, basically. And it's not forgiving.
Well, and that was one thing. I mean, we don't know, but I'm curious because we talked about it a little bit. I don't know specifics, but this is the one course that really isn't that up to date on safety standards in terms of like track safety.
Yeah.
And I'm curious too if the barriers that they have, a lot of them are the metal barriers
You see on the highway.
that you see on the highway. I'm curious the lack of forgiveness that you get from a barrier like that compared to what they have, you know, the ones that kind of cushion the driver.
Well, I almost think that that's why we saw some of the incidents that we saw.
Yeah.
So
I do feel like the kissing of the wall was a really
that was
huge
I think the big
aspect. There was almost this like plastic or whatever material of advertisements along a lot of the track, and you saw most of it getting ripped off.
Yeah, I felt really bad for the companies that probably paid a lot of money to be on that wall, and it's just completely shredded.
Yeah, I definitely
But I think like Rolex is going to be okay.
Well, and I think it was funny, too, because a lot of Grand Prix, when on the radio you hear, oh, I hit the wall, a lot of times it's, oh, crap, that person's done. But almost every single person was hit the wall. And a lot of times it was just a kiss.
Yeah, and I think even the commentators were like, how many people have hit the wall? And they start listing every single person who's kind of hit the wall. So those were the main things, honestly, in all three practices. The big one that kind of brought out a red flag in FP1 was Zhou. He actually hit the barrier at the point called the corner turn, whatever it's called, Saint Devotee, whatever it is, and his front wing plate on obviously his front wing came off, and Charles actually ran over it.
He promptly ran over it.
Yes, of course,
it was like
naturally.
Perfect timing.
Yeah, and of course, going into this weekend, everybody just wants Charles to do well. It's his home Grand Prix, and this was probably the best chance that he was going to have, and so you just wanted to do well, and then for him to, in the first practice session of the weekend, to kind of pick up some damage potentially to his floor from going over someone's rear wing is kind of nerve-wracking, but I think he ended up being completely fine, got back out there. There was also one other Alpine issue in the free practice session in FP1. I don't know if you have any notes on that one.
Yeah, so it was discussed on the radio as Pierre Gasly was going through FP1. His team called him back in, and he was like, what's the issue? And everyone was, I mean, this isn't typical. A lot of times when there is an issue with the car, the team will say, like, we'll discuss when you come in, because the radios are public, but they said it was a power unit issue, which also shortly thereafter, Esteban got on the radio and complained about having an issue with his car, which Alpine did clarify it was not the same issue, and I believe Pierre was out for most of FP1, but he was back in FP2.
Yeah, I believe they were both back in FP2.
Yeah, it didn't cause too big of a problem. I will say something that was consistently an issue in practice was Max Verstappen. Not him being an issue, he had
Max
issues.
Verstappen was the issue.
No, he had a slew of issues that I think, while a lot of them do complain on the radios during practices, I mean, these are the moments when the team is working out kinks from traveling, rebuilding the cars, new setups, new packages, whatever. He consistently complained about the car being on a knife edge, jumping like a kangaroo is the one quote that everyone has repeatedly used. So it definitely seems like there is some sort of issue going on with,
and we saw this last year in Singapore. They just do not do well with street courses because their car cannot handle the bouncing of an actual street.
And they've talked about that going into this weekend.
Yeah, they knew that it wasn't going to be a good weekend for them.
How the curbs and the bouncing does not do well for the Red Bull setup.
Well, and so on top of Max having those issues, they actually at one point showed Checo's driver cam, like his helmet cam, and you see the bouncing as he's going through one of the turns, and they mentioned, they were like, just know that like this camera is very solidly on the car, and so Checo's eyesight is going to be even bouncier than this, and I could not see the turns whatsoever. And when they showed his helmet cam, I'm like, I have no idea how he's driving right now, because I would have crashed into something.
Yeah, I mean, going into next weekend or the next Grand Prix, I don't think that this is going to be an issue for them. It's a very drastically different course.
They're going to be back to normal, I think, next weekend.
But I am curious because just this performance was
not great for them.
Not great.
Well, and so then we get into FP3, and the main thing that I've written down was that Bottas had actually tapped the wall exiting La Piscine, and he sustained front right suspension damage and brought out a red flag when he failed to make it through La Riscas, I think it has. I don't know how you say it necessarily, but I think that's how you say it. But yeah, the biggest issue really was resulting people slightly hitting the walls and sometimes slightly hitting it a little bit more than others, and then if you're going to hit it on your side, you're likely going to get suspension damage, and then the car is going to have to get fixed. So between FP3 and qualifying, Bottas's car had to get fixed.
Yeah, I also think we haven't mentioned that Charles consistently had a strong performance throughout practice. I think FP1 might have been his weakest.
It was.
Performance, but FP2, FP3, he really, I mean, he seemed confident. I mean, it's his home turf.
I think Charles went into this weekend knowing, based on the past few races and how in Miami, Lando was able to beat Max. Last weekend in Imola, Lando was 0.7 away from Max at the end. That this was, and knowing that the Red Bulls are not good on street courses, that this was his best chance to win.
Yeah.
And I feel like he went into this weekend, every time he got in that car and was driving, it was like a dog with a bone, just like dangling it in front of him, like trying to get it. And I think you saw that even throughout the race.
Definitely. I think, too, there was just, he seemed to understand what he needed to do. Like, someone would top the time, and he would outperform.
Yeah.
Like, it seemed like no matter where the bar was set this weekend, he was able to hit that mark. And I don't know if that was just confidence, you know, all of these years of it almost being the dangling carrot, you know, right in front of him. But yeah, I definitely think compared to, you know, 2023, I think 2024, the performance of certain teams is being shaken. And I think
things are shifting.
Yeah, and I think drivers that were okay being in second and third, like Charles, like Lando for a while, not okay, but just kind of settled for it.
Yeah, because I think almost for them, like last year, getting second was winning.
Yeah, where I think this is, you're seeing that, like, the chomping at the bit, the determination, the fact that they're in the race.
Yeah.
I personally don't really have much else from free practice.
That's all that I have really from the practice
I
sessions.
feel like knowing Monaco, knowing its past, I'm surprised practice was so clean.
Both practice and qualifying.
Qualifying, like, I'm just surprised things were so clean. The few issues that we did have, you know,
I feel like on a normal weekend,
slightly minor damage.
On a normal weekend, we see a little bit more crashing even during practice, I feel like.
Yeah.
But I do wonder if the drivers go into the weekend knowing, like, I have to have a perfect line or else I will crash and cause damage. And they take every session like that, like thinking about how there's a potential. If I'm offline, I'm in the barriers, and obviously they don't want that. So I think that they go into the weekend with that mentality.
Definitely.
So, qualifying?
Totally.
All right, so for the first qualifying session of the weekend, my main things that I really wrote down was that Lando, I think in both Q1 and Q2, I felt like my heart was dropped because he was in like, so in Q1, I think he was 14th before he did his last lap, and then he jumped up. But I really thought he was going to be out in Q1.
I think he was actually closer to a knockout threat.
He might have been in the bottom 5, actually.
I think he was in the bottom 5, and so is Checo. And
but Oscar wasn't. Oscar was doing well the whole time.
Oscar was doing well. But I think there was this moment where both Lando and Checo needed to perform to a certain degree. Lando beat that degree, and Checo could not move out past Q1. I do think one thing to note was that traffic was a problem almost right away, like it typically is. But it stayed consistently a problem.
Well, yeah, so normally one thing that we always complain about is that the drivers for qualifying everybody will go out immediately, do 1 or 2 slower laps, and then go and do a fast lap. And then they'll all go into the pits. And they'll wait there for like 5-10 minutes, and then they'll go back out for the very end. You did not see that this weekend for any of the qualifying sessions. You were out basically the whole time, and when you stopped in for the pits, it was change the tires, look at some data really quickly, and go back out. You did not just sit there.
I think the only moment I distinctly remember there only being one car on the grid was when Alex Albon, I don't remember which part of qualifying that was.
I think that was Q3.
When he had the grid by himself. But besides that, I think there was almost a moment where every single person was on the grid because the people that were in the knockout range had to get out of there. I mean...
Well, yeah, and I mean, even at the beginning of Q1, I remember the commentator saying about how the line in the pit lane, people were so eager to get out there. Mercedes had been out there for 5 minutes.
5 minutes before Q1 started.
So that they could get at the front of the pit lane.
Could be the first, yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the cars ended up doing that because they did not want to get stuck behind traffic.
Well, I think something to note, too, especially for people that are as new to the sport as we are, is a lot of people talk about how there's more importance on a Saturday for Monaco specifically than there is on Sunday. Qualifying can really determine where you end your race, and I think we saw that in just the race results. I mean, the top 4 or 5, the top, I think, 6, 7, 8 were what they were in qualifying.
Well, and I mean, last year, Checo qualified P20 last year, and he ended up only moving all the way up to P16, which I don't even know how he did that, to be honest.
But I think this just shows you that qualifying at this course is more important than the actual race.
Yeah. Because normally in other races, you're going to have a few more straights where you could use DRS to get past someone, or your turns are going to be a little bit wider so you could cut in on the inside and then potentially pass someone.
But there's just no
Your
room.
turns, you can't cut around someone, basically, and you have one DRS zone, and it's pretty short. So if you actually do get to pass someone in a DRS, it's like you're lucky. So qualifying is basically, unless something insane happens, it's essentially the order that you're going to finish in the next day. One thing also to make note of in Q1, which was actually kind of interesting at the beginning, I don't know if you remember seeing both Haas's were doing really well in Q1, which was kind of interesting. So they ended up making it onto Q2. Those who were out in Q1 were Fernando Alonso, Logan Sargent, Checo Perez, Valtteri Bottas, and Zhou Guanyu. I do think that Logan Sargent was very close. Like Logan Sargent and Fernando Alonso were pretty close to making it into Q2, but they just missed it.
Yeah, I'm curious to see what is going to happen with Aston Martin in the next few weeks, because I think that I don't want to say downfall, but the kind of drop of Aston Martin is happening in my eyes
so much
significantly faster than it did last season.
Well, they weren't, no matter when they were slower last year, they weren't this slow.
Well, and it just seems like they're just having huge issues. There's no fight.
And typically when you do well, if you've won this race in the past, you know how to put together a good qualifying lap. It doesn't matter how fast your car is. It doesn't matter if you have won every single race this season. If you don't know how to put together a perfect qualifying lap, you're not going to do well. And Fernando Alonso has won this race in the past.
Yeah.
So he knows how to put together a good qualifying lap for it. And for him to come P16, kind of wild.
Yeah, they're definitely a team in the strange sentence in the lower rankings right now that I'm keeping an eye on, because their performance has gotten so poor so quickly.
At the beginning of the season, I honestly remember saying that I thought that the Constructors' Championship is going to be Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren, and then Mercedes or Aston, depending on who got their upgrades right. And then I even said that Aston could be up there with McLaren if they really get their upgrades right. But I think they just have not gotten their upgrades right, and I don't know what's going on. But anyways, on to Q2. So the Haas's could not get the speed that they had in Q1. I don't know why, but they both ended up actually getting kicked out in Q2. Pierre actually just had edged out his teammate Esteban to move on to Q3, and Yuki and Alex also put together some pretty good laps to make it on to Q3.
I also think you saw Max put in a bigger fight in Q2.
Yeah.
He was closer to the top. I think, honestly, out of the whole weekend, I think his most confident performance, based off of, I think his best result on paper was Q2.
What did he come in Q2?
I think he topped the chart of Q2. I have to double check.
Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. But, no, he had the top time for a while, and then Lando, I think, ended up topping.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So he held it for a bit, but I think it's just, again, it's really, I know that the Red Bull doesn't perform well, but I think I'm shocked by the fact that there was 40 to 20 second time differences only a handful of races ago.
Yeah.
That the distance between Red Bull and everyone else has closed in 3 races.
I feel like even at the beginning of the season in qualifying, I remember saying, literally, I think on the podcast, is that either the Red Bull is really bad at qualifying and really good at a long distance race, or everybody else's car are really good at qualifying and really shitty at the race. And I am convinced now that it is the first one, that the Red Bull is really bad at qualifying, and because there wasn't that big of a gap in qualifying no matter what.
Yeah.
But for this, if the car specifically was not made for this track and it's already not a good qualifying car, then he's not going to do well. Yeah. But, then you see a car like the Haas, where I remember last year when Hulk would end up qualifying, there was one race where he qualified, P3 or something like that. But then they just could not keep it up in the race. They had a really good qualifying car, but a really horrible racing car, so it was, the opposite of what the Red Bull was.
True.
But, yeah. Anything else on Q2?
Nope.
So those who ended up getting out in Q2 were Esteban Ocon, Nico Hulkenberg, Daniel Ricciardo, Lance Stroll, and Kevin Magnussen. Actually, one thing to mention about Q2 was Daniel Ricciardo did say to his race engineer that he just could not put together a good lap, that like the car was feeling really slippery, that he just could not put together a good lap, which is interesting because he has won this race before and he has come close to it winning it before in the past as well. So I just don't know about Danny sometimes. I think I said this like every single episode. I just feel like he's struggling in so many different aspects of racing.
Well, it's interesting, too, because I think coming in, at least from a media perspective, I mean, he was on cloud nine.
He was really positive.
He was positive. He was like, I feel more like a rock star in Monaco than I do anywhere else. So I think having that level of confidence, but then having this performance in qualifying and, you know, the performance he has in the race, I feel like we say it every week, you know, I think we say the same thing about certain people all the time, and I feel bad for the people listening, but I do. I feel like he's lost. He can't find his footing either in the car or just on the grid.
Yeah.
And I'm not really sure he himself knows what he needs.
Yeah.
And if he does, I hope
he finds it.
Yeah, I'm excited for the improvement.
Yeah. So Q3, after one lap of Charles doing like an actual fast lap, he reported that there was something moving in the pedals. Don't think that they ever figured out what it was. They never announced it to any of us at all.
There was there was that. I think me and you gasped, and then there was no further commentary on it.
Yeah, I was like, oh no, and then it was over.
And then he took pole.
Yeah. So Charles ended up taking pole position, which is great. The only thing that was literally my only note for Q3 because Q3 was pretty simple actually, and it just was people just trying to get a fast lap, and that was really it.
I don't want to say the biggest upset, but I think the biggest upset of the session was Max placing 6th, obviously. Carlos did place 3rd in Q3, and there was discussion because there was an impeding issue, an impediment that happened earlier in qualifying that people believed, because it was very similar to what happened to Oscar Piastri in the prior race weekend, people believed that Carlos Sainz was actually going to receive a 3rd place grid penalty as well.
But he did not.
Which was a bummer because of the similarity between the weekend and, again, my biggest gripe, inconsistencies with the FIA, but I digress.
He really got lucky this weekend.
Yeah, he got very lucky this weekend on several things. But because of that, there was discussion at the end of qualifying of, McLaren being in that 2-3 position, but it did not come to fruition.
Yeah.
The stewards decided that there was no further necessary action.
Yeah, so the order for Q3 was Charles, Oscar, Carlos, Lando, George, Max, Lewis, Yuki, Alex, and Pierre. This was the first Q3 finish for both Williams and Alpine, so this was great for them. And then one thing that actually we all found out later on in the day on Saturday after qualifying had happened was that both Haas cars were disqualified from qualifying. So what that means is obviously since qualifying had already happened, both of them
deleted.
Yeah, all of their times were deleted, so therefore they were going to start 19th and 20th, and everybody else behind them were shifting up a little bit. So the reason why they ended up getting disqualified was because of a DRS issue. So like we said in the last episode, a lot of teams bring new upgrades for this weekend specifically because they need specific downforce packages. So their rear wings are going to be a little bit different most of the time. If you notice, most of the time for Monaco, it's going to be a much thicker rear wing than in other races, and the gap between parts of the rear wing, usually in the DRS section, were too large from what I could understand. And so once qualifying was done and all the cars were in parc fermé, the stewards looked at the actual car and realized that it was not
up to the millimeter standard.
Yeah, and so they had to obviously move back to 19th and 20th, and they also had to race with not a specific downforce rear wing for this track. So they had to go back to their old rear wing, which kind of sucks for them. But that's all I have for qualifying. Race time. So the start of the race seems to be where most of the quote-unquote passing can happen. I don't believe that you can actually see the turn into turn one. Like, as a driver, you can't really see it. So you kind of have to, like, full send. And I believe that the commentators were saying the last time somebody did that was David Coulthard back in like 2000-something. So it doesn't happen very often. And then also just a reminder, the race has not been won outside of the top three since like the 70s or something like that.
It's been, ridiculously long length of time.
Yeah, so if you're not in the top three, chances are you're not going to win the race. The start happens, everybody basically stays in their own places, and they go around the turns. And a few turns into the race, Carlos actually like locks up. I believe he got a puncture. And it looked like Charles and Oscar were getting away from them, and I was like screaming at the TV like, Lando, pass Carlos, come on. And then Carlos ends up in like a runoff area.
Yeah, so I have a running list of all of the people and issues that happened within the first lap.
Yeah, the first lap was chaos.
So Charles kept the lead off the start, and then just chaos ensued. So if you actually look back at replays, there was slight contact between Carlos and Piastri, which caused Carlos to suffer a puncture, and Oscar actually suffered a little bit of damage to the side. So that's what Emma was referring to when Carlos ran off. At this point, unknown to the spectators, because we're watching what's happening to Carlos, because they typically keep you, like, focused on the very front of the pack. Checo and Magnussen at the very end of the pack hit each other. K-Mag kind of gets on the inside between the wall and Checo. Checo gets too close to the wall. They clip each other, which then ends up affecting Hülkenberg, and this really just ultimately destroyed Checo's Red Bull. Like, there was really just the seat little section was left, and it damaged the Haas. And then also, while this was going on, in another section of the grid, Ocon and Gasly decided to play some bumper cars and hit each other, with Ocon catching quite a significant amount of air. So this resulted in a red flag and 40-minute break.
Yeah. This was the majority of the action that happened in the whole race.
That was pretty much, yeah.
And I do have some comments to break down this situation.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a rundown so that you guys can understand, like, watching it. If you didn't watch it, like, please go back and just watch.
It's like 5 minutes of the race, not even. It's a good 30 seconds, honestly.
Because it happens, and as spectators, I do think, like, F1 TV did the best they could, but it was very confusing.
Yeah.
Just figuring out when all of this happened and realizing that it all happened simultaneously.
Yeah. So, okay. Let's go over the Carlos one first. So, when the start happens, it looks like Oscar and Charles get off together. You don't actually see, because Oscar and Carlos had contact with Oscar, correct? And that's where his puncture was. Mm-hmm. And so Lando is right behind Carlos, and it looks like Carlos is just holding up the pack. Turns out he had a puncture, and he goes off track. At this point, this is the first incident that we're seeing happen on TV. We have no idea about K-Mag, Checo, Hulk, Esteban, and Pierre yet. No idea that any of that's going on. And so we're seeing this happen, and we're just like, Carlos is out of the race. Sucks
We're
for
like,
you.
Amazing. Lando, oh my God, podium.
Yeah,
McLaren,
a dream
great.
podium. And then immediately after, we see all of the other issues. But before we get to the other issues, the red flag, we don't know when it actually shows up as spectators in that moment. We're pretty sure now, after the fact, that the red flag showed up before Carlos went off the track, because the crash between K-Mag, Hulk, and Checo must have happened before Carlos actually went off track, but as a spectator and as drivers, they didn't know that it had happened yet.
Well, it was really hard to understand the timing, because when they give you the replay, which this is something that would have, I think, really benefited F1 TV if they gave you the replay and actually gave you the timestamp of what time when they were in the race, especially for a situation like this when three issues in different sections of the race simultaneously are happening. But yeah, I think as spectators, we didn't know, but my hunch is that the stewards looked at exactly when Carlos went off track and when the flags were raised.
Yeah. So I think, according to the stewards, that the flags were raised before Carlos went off track. As a fan, I don't think the flags were actually raised yet. I think that they were saying let's raise them, but I don't think that they were actually up.
From my journalistic perspective,
this is my hunch.
Where I.
And so later on, obviously a red flag went up because of all of these incidents, and everybody went back into the pit lane. And
40-minute break.
Before the restart happens, we find out that Carlos is going to start P3. And I'm a little irritated about this because, first of all, it's so impossible to pass, and you went off track because you decided to have a puncture because of your issues with Oscar. And so why should Lando be penalized and pushed back because of you? But apparently the stewards think that it was his time and he should be P3.
I think the frustrating part is that it probably boils down to the timing when he pulled off track and when the red flag is raised. But I think for us, the frustration is that if the red flag never got raised, Carlos never would have stayed in third.
He wouldn't even have come. He probably would have retired.
He probably would have come in dead last, retired. And so that is where I think the spectator frustration is with the rules, is the fact that if that red flag, if the Checo crash had not spurred the red flag, Carlos would have never placed. But it's, again, one of those, as Max said,
if my mom was my dad, she'd have balls. Yeah. Well, okay. So that's the whole Carlos situation. And then we get to the K-Mag, Hulk, Checo situation. Reminder. Hulkenberg has gotten points this season because K-Mag has essentially sacrificed himself several times now. And K-Mag has also received several penalty points because of that. And he's 2 points away from being banned from a race. And Hulkenberg has a seat next year. K-Mag and Checo are both basically racing for their careers. So the way that it went on TV, it looked like K-Mag had priority over Hulk, basically, around the turn. He was ahead of Hulkenberg. And Checo was ever so slightly ahead of K-Mag, but they were kind of alongside at the same time. K-Mag was maybe a third of a car length alongside Checo. And yes, it's a start, so, there's going to be carnage, there's going to be chaos, but I feel like in the past, a lot of the commentators have said, in a start this tight and messy, you have to be looking into your side mirrors, because there could be someone alongside. And I do think that the incident with K-Mag and Checo, then crashing into Hulk was almost preventable if either K-Mag had backed off or Checo hadn't squeezed K-Mag into the wall, essentially. Because basically K-Mag was squeezed into the wall. He hit Checo a little bit.
Well, he kissed the wall, which in that sense, laws of physics, he gets pushed off the wall into Checo. Checo flips around, which then also pulls Hulkenberg into it. So it ensued into chaos. But I think that is a really good point that you're making, is the fact that from any angle and any perspective, it could be K-Mag or it could be Checo's fault. And I think that...
Apparently, they're not investigating it anymore and no one's going to get a penalty. But I think that they're doing that because they know that you can't decide who to give the penalty to.
There's multiple things, but I also think they're not deciding on it because we've talked about it before in past episodes. The first lap, the kind of gentleman's
racing
agreement. Anything can happen in the first lap. First laps are notorious for carnage and chaos. It's hard to penalize in the first lap.
Yeah.
And so I think that is what is the saving grace for Kevin, and honestly for Checo too, is the fact that it is that gentleman's agreement first lap.
Yeah.
I think it came out, I actually have to say, I'm okay putting it to rest. I'm
not going to say whose fault it is.
I think I'm in total... I am not going to die on either hill. I think I'm in total agreement that it is either person's fault. Because think about their mindset. Yeah, think about their mindset. They're probably both thinking multiple things at the same time.
It's the start. I need to get as far ahead as I can, or else I'm not going to be able to pass anybody.
Or if I stay here, he'll back off and vice versa.
Yeah.
So...
I agree. So that happened. Obviously, none of them were racing for the rest of the race, so they all retired.
Yeah, quick retirement.
No question, obviously. All drivers were okay.
Also, shout out to Joe.
Yeah, Joe was just behind all of this carnage, and he slowed down and just, watched it happen, and then slowly drove through the debris, and was able to continue racing. The other incident between Esteban and Pierre. So, it was around the turn right before the tunnel. And I feel like that turn right before the tunnel is kind of similar to one of the turns that was in Miami, where, it was the turn that they both went side by side on at Miami.
Okay, yeah.
And it just reminds me of it, the angles of it, but I don't think that turn is as wide as the one in Miami, so you really shouldn't be fitting two cars across, and I think Esteban probably imagined, we did it in Miami, we can do it here. And again, it's on the first lap, you think that you have more room than you do, and... Basically, Esteban was slightly ahead of Pierre around the turn because he took the inside and really cut it tightly. And so then Pierre, because you can't cut it as tight as Esteban, I think, was hoping. He then went out a little wide, and so Pierre ended up basically causing Esteban to fly in the air. And so then obviously it caused damage for Esteban's car because I'm sure his floor was basically screwed. Yeah. And you hear Pierre's radio message being like, what did he do? Why did he do that for? The car is completely damaged now. And after the fact, Esteban obviously did not finish the race. He retired afterwards. Yeah, we thought that he was going to be okay, but then all of a sudden, he's walking around in jeans, and we're like, okay, so I guess he's done.
Yeah.
And he apologized on TV. He was like, I take full responsibility. It was not a good idea. I weirdly think Esteban this season has been very level-headed a lot of times. He's taken responsibility for the things that he's done that are not okay. And the team principal from Alpine, in some quote or whatever, he said that there will be consequences for Ocon's actions, that they were not okay, and yada, yada, yada. I feel like that is a very extreme
Well, especially knowing the fact that it was announced that because of the collision with his teammate, Esteban was handed a time penalty, but due to the fact that he DNF'd the race, it's now being pushed to Canada, and it will be a 5-place grid drop. So hopefully those are the penalties or consequences.
No,
that
it sounded
he's
like
talking about.
he was talking about like internal consequences.
I mean, I definitely think that.
And both Pierre and Esteban's contracts are up for at the end of the year.
I mean, listen, this is not the first. I wouldn't be surprised if this is the first driver. If one of them is
not re-signed.
Look at what's happening to Valtteri. Valtteri hates what's going on at Sauber, so he's like, I'm looking elsewhere. I wouldn't be surprised if they want to push consequences on these guys. I mean, they'll look elsewhere. But if this is the situation that's gonna like. He's apologized. He's doing the PR. I mean, there's been
What more
worse.
do you want sometimes?
Well, and he's getting the 5-place grid penalty. Like, I don't know. I think...
I do feel like in the past, Esteban has definitely been a little hot-headed sometimes with these things. And he would not apologize. He would do these things with teammates. And he has said, like, in Miami, he was like, I had so much fun racing with Pierre. Like, the side-by-side intense racing, it was so much fun. Like, that's the kind of stuff that I love. And in past years, you've seen him compete with teammates to this extent where, like, they've both crashed sometimes because they get so close in races. And I almost think, like, the saying of, like, your biggest rival is your teammate because you're an equal machinery. I think he can sometimes have taken that too far in the past. But in the past, he would not have apologized, where now he is. And he has been very good for the team this year, I think. I hope that this does not mean that they're not going to re-sign him next year, that it would be such a quick, like, shutdown.
I would be surprised, too, especially kind of... I feel like I saw a lot of the leadership of, like, George Russell and Mercedes with Lewis's announcement. I feel like I saw a lot of that with Esteban the past few races. Like, no offense to Pierre Gasly, but I feel like out of the two,
Esteban has performed better.
Stepped up, too, like, in the media perspective. Like, I feel like he has seemed, like, a bit more mature from that perspective. But, yeah, I'm intrigued to see, hopefully the 5-place grid penalty is what he was referring to, but, I mean, if it's anything further, I think it would probably put quite a large amount of distaste in people's,
Yeah, I think overall, Alpine has a lot of things that they need to get figured out.
I think Alpine and Sauber, have a lot of, like, internal pains that kind of need addressing.
Yeah.
But... What do we know?
The rest of the race was basically it was a 45-minute break, red flag. They restart, clean restart, basically a clean rest of the race.
16-car restart.
Yeah, 16-car restart. And eventually it just turns into the top four kind of sticking together, then there being a bit of a gap, and the gap was between Lando and George, and George was trying to push really hard to try and make sure that there's not too much of a gap between him and Lando, because if you build a 19-second gap between you and the person in front of you, it's giving them essentially a free pit stop so that they can stop and then hopefully come out ahead of you, or if they come out directly behind you, they have better tires, they're going to be able to try and pass you a lot easier. That was the majority of the race, I would say.
It was weird.
Because then Fernando did the same thing where he helped create a gap so that Lance could get new tires. I
feel like there were weird clumps of driving groups. So there was the top four. Then there was that, 15 to 20 second gap between George and Lando. Then there was the huge gap between Yuki and Lewis, which was, like over a minute.
Eventually it got up to like
over a lap.
Yeah.
It just felt really weirdly segmented, and a comment that multiple drivers made post-race was that it felt significantly longer this time around. And it felt like that strategy of playing with the gaps of time was what kind of increased, like, it was just I mean, we've never watched a Monaco Grand Prix this closely, or for me ever before, but it was a very strange way of racing that, like, we've never seen.
Yeah, so there were several points throughout the race where Carlos was commenting to his race engineer that they needed to slow down so that the gap between Lando and George wasn't as big, so that Lando wouldn't be able to get a free pit stop. And so it was almost like they were trying to drive the slowest sometimes, for some of the drivers. And then we see the gap, like Max and Lewis and George were all together, basically, the three of them, which is kind of a funny combo in my opinion. But then we see, like, Alex Albon at one point, actually, after the race, he was like, I was so confused why we were going so slow, because it was like, I understand you want to preserve your tires and everything, but 20 laps into it, we're already being lapped by the top racers. Like, what is going on?
It was strange in the sense that, like, I feel like the performance for certain teams, like, you just could not, like, I don't know what next weekend is going to bring, because, like, some people were just driving so much slow, like, I feel like
because it's so hard to pass here, people were almost just like, I'm going to conserve my tires so that I don't have to go in and pit, so I can just stay here for the rest of the race and ensure nobody passes me.
And we've seen the races where it's all about the pit strategy, it's all about the tire strategy, and this, it just felt like it's all about the weird,
it's all about where you ended up qualifying and if you can stay there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was basically the entire rest of the race, I feel like.
Yeah.
But Lance, he did end up going... There were a few people that ended up pitting for new tires because they had the gap. Lando had the gap for a lap or two, but they didn't take it, which I don't know if they should have taken it or not. The world may never know. Max and Lewis both had a big enough gap to do it, and they did. It didn't change their performance at all, though. They both stayed exactly where they were. Bottas pitted. I think he pitted twice, to be honest.
I think he did, too. He pitted at 16, and then I don't have where he pitted again.
But I think he did, because he ended up just walking. Logan Sargent pitted. I know that because... before the restart, they ended up putting brand new hards on, and he had already started on hards, so that he had to pit, so that he had a second tire.
I want to talk about Logan for a second.
Okay.
So, I'll be honest, there was a moment where the top four were lapping people, and it got very confusing as to, like, who they've lapped once, who they've lapped twice. And there was a moment where Logan ended up getting passed and stayed right behind Lando Norris and just shaved seconds off towards the end. And watching it, I was just, I mean, there wasn't, like we've said, it was kind of a quiet race towards the end. Like, we knew it was going to happen, how it was going to end. Watching him shave 7 seconds off in, like, 8 laps.
And yeah, he is getting a tow from Lando in the McLaren, but
it was just like, you're following his line. Like, you're
the tow's not gonna
like, you're
drag you that
up.
much.
Yeah, you're not
It's gonna give you a good punch to the air, but it's not going to help you drag
for laps.
Yeah, and he followed him for laps.
And that was something that no one. I don't think anyone commented on. No one was really talking about. I'm curious if Williams will talk about it, but it was just a section of it was really in the last 10, 15 laps that it happened.
Yeah.
But just watching it, his time went from, being in the mid-teens to, only like 6, 7 seconds to the person in front of him. So it was definitely, I don't know, it was a moment where I was like, dude, we see you can do it.
Yeah.
Like, you can follow suit. Like,
you can race.
Yeah.
But, I don't know. It's very strange what's going on with him right now.
Yeah. But that was just something I wanted to point
No,
out.
that was definitely important to talk about. So, yeah, the Lance Stroll thing. Lance had pitted, and...
Yeah, so he pitted at lap 44.
Yeah, and then on lap 50... Well, so Fernando basically sacrificed his own race so that they could create a big enough gap between him and Lance so that Lance had the time to go in, get a free pit stop, and come out ahead of Fernando. So 40 laps of Fernando doing this for him. Lance goes in, lap 44, gets new tires, comes out. They're saying he's going to catch up. He's going to shave all this time off. Lap 50, Lance gets a puncture. It was in that chicane that's right after the tunnel, when you come out of the tunnel. He hit the side of the barrier ever so slightly and ended up getting a puncture, and
It
happened in a perfect spot, though.
Yeah, the, tire remnants fell off right on basically the shoulder of the pit entrance. So it didn't cause a safety car or yellow flags or anything.
Yeah.
They were able to safely remove it. And it honestly, safety cars would have switched up some people's strategy, but I think it was better that it wasn't in anyone's way.
Yeah.
That last thing we need is another more damage.
And I feel like the rest of the time, the main thing that was happening was, the back and forth of, Oscar being about a second away from Charles, and then Carlos being between half a second to about 2 seconds away from
Max did
Oscar.
start to crawl on George.
Yeah.
But, yeah,
Lando was, half a second to a second away from Carlos, and, all 4 of the top 4, they just sat there, basically.
Yeah.
Sometimes it would get up to, a second and a half, and then it would go back down to, 0.2.
Well, and then it
felt like it looked like they were going to pass each other at some points, and they just didn't.
Well, and then we got to, last 8 or 10 laps, and Charles's radio comes on. He's like, we'll bring this home. So it was one of those that, I'm super thrilled that he was able to achieve this, but it was kind of not a lot happened towards the end.
And I think the drivers have even commented on it. They're like, not a lot typically happens at Monaco, but I think some of them were like, it was less entertaining than usual just because there really was nothing going on and people were just trying to go slower than others. So yeah, it was overall a strange race. Very happy for Charles that he ended up finally winning his home race. He said, the last 10 laps, he was thinking about his dad, and, the last 2 laps, he was trying not to cry because he wanted to make sure he could continue seeing through his visor. And he was definitely close to crying in the post-race interview.
Yeah, I think overall it was just, a happy ending. I think it was a happy achievement, something that someone has tried to for so long in their career, and like we said, it's been the carrot dangling in front of him. Yeah. And to do it in a Ferrari, it's a fairy tale ending.
Again, I kept saying, do not George Russell it.
Yeah, I think, too, that there was a really interesting opportunity that's happening right now for not only a team like Williams scoring their first points. Alex ended up finishing in 9th, so Williams and Alpine are actually tied right now in the Constructors' Championships. But also I think the fact that we're not seeing Red Bull on top, that we're seeing
We did not see one Red Bull on the podium this weekend.
I also think it's really interesting how tight McLaren and Ferrari are with each other. But yeah, I think that Canada is going to be drastically different. But I think for our first Monaco, it was
a pretty good race.
Yeah, obviously not everything can be that exciting, and this is more of a historical race, so the track, the cars have gotten so large that's what also affects this. But I think the history, the people that are there, there's just
the actual prince and princess of Monaco.
Yeah, there's so much importance to this race, to the sport, that, it's pivotal.
Yeah. All right, final thoughts? So overall, like we've said, it wasn't the most exciting actual race, but I would say that it was a pretty good weekend. F2 was also there this past weekend, and we got to see a pretty insane reaction time from one of the F2 drivers. So, if some of you remember from last season, there is a Red Bull Junior driver named Isaac Hadjar, and he is racing in F2. And actually, in the tunnel, I believe it was during qualifying or a practice session for them. I think it was a practice session on Friday. He was in the tunnel, and there was another driver who was right ahead of him who I think there was an issue with his car and he had to slow down and he was on the inside part of the tunnel, and Isaac Hadjar basically could not see him until the very last second and had to immediately move to the side, and it was like a split-second reaction time.
Yeah, I think it's gone viral everywhere. It was all over TikTok. I mean, I saw it on 2 or 3 different threads on Reddit.
Yeah.
Like, it really was everywhere.
And I always like to joke around being like, oh, like any of us could really drive a fast car. I would not have a reaction time like that.
Don't think I personally have seen a reaction time like that. Like, that's needed to be. But I mean, for like, at the end of the day, it could have been so bad.
Could have been really bad. Because I feel like crashes that have happened in that tunnel are horrific.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about what happened in 94 with Lendlinger. Yeah. Like, I mean, it's definitely a dangerous race course anywhere on it, tunnel including. But, yeah, that definitely was, I mean, it was jaw-dropping.
It really shows you that, like, I mean, there's a lot that shows you have to be very on top of your game in F1 and just motorsport in general, but I think when you see moments like that, it's like, okay, this is not an average person sport.
Yeah, I also think, again, like, it makes you touch some grass and be like, okay, no, as much as I can, I actually cannot drive
Well, okay, the reason why I always think, I'm like, oh, I could totally drive that car, is because they're stupid little button game. Where they have, like, the light-up buttons, and they have to hit
helps. That is the reason why they have that reaction rate.
Okay, but watching them play those games, I'm like, that is not that hard. Those games are easy.
Did you ever play Bop It a lot?
Yeah, it reminds me of...
I'm asking you like we didn't grow up
or,
together.
like, Whack-A-Mole. Like, it reminds me of that stuff. Like, trying to, like, picture...
I want to watch you play Bop It, because I feel like Bop It will tell me if you're good. Like, if I would trust you to drive an F1 car.
I mean, I wouldn't trust any of us to drive an F1 car.
But I feel like, depending on how long you could play a game of Bop It, that'll give me a good baseline indicator.
I don't know. Maybe. It's been a long time since I played Bop It.
Anyways, I think overall, too, this weekend was weirdly integral to drivers and constructors standings.
Yes.
There was a bit of shakeup. First thing I want to note is that, unfortunately, Checo has now moved down to 5th in the driver's standings at 107 points. Charles is in 2nd, and Lando is in 3rd, with Carlos coming up in 4th. So I think Carlos was actually ahead of Lando last weekend as well, and Lando has moved up. Also, like I stated, Alex Albon got 2 points this weekend, so snaps for Williams. Loved to see that. I also just want to comment that right now, Red Bull is still in the lead with 276 points, but Ferrari is in 2nd with 252 points. So that's getting really tight.
Yeah,
I don't know. I think it's going to get really tight. I think
there's a chance, potentially, that if they keep up this, and...
I think that there's a chance that Ferrari could surpass them, but I do think that McLaren will make that surpassing slower, because I think McLaren's going to eat up points, too.
Yeah.
Like,
and I think that the Drivers' Championship is not going to be a blowout with Max winning like it was last year. Everyone kept saying that this weekend, that, like, after leaving Bahrain, we all thought this was going to be another easy season for Max, that he was going to try and win just every single race this year compared to last year. I think that we are going to get to a point in the season where we don't actually know who's going to win the championship. Like, right now, even though Max is in the lead... I don't know if he's going to win.
We have 5 people that are over 100 points right now. Max is in the lead with 169 points, and Charles is behind him with 138.
I mean,
we're
it's
in round,
pretty
what,
close.
round 7?
This was round 8.
Round 8? Yeah, there's still a lot of points left in the season. Granted, who knows what Red Bull is going to bring. Like, that's the other thing we're talking about this. Red Bull has upgrades. Everyone has upgrades. Every car does better at different tracks. But, I think it's going to be significantly closer. And one thing that they did mention, too, is that this season so far, we've already had 4 different race
That's more
winners.
than we had last year at all.
Yeah, so that also shows you how, like, it is a toss-up, but I definitely think, placing in 6th and only gaining 8 points this weekend really probably didn't help Max, whereas, Charles, got those 25 points.
Yeah, 100%.
So, it's definitely going to be interesting. I think Ferrari will pass Red Bull if they continue on this streak, but I don't think it's going to be,
it's going to be tight to the end, I think.
I think McLaren's going to eat up points more than we think.
Yeah. From both teams. From both Red Bull and Ferrari. I don't think it's going to be a clear idea of who's going to get it.
Yeah.
Because also McLaren could throw themselves in there.
Yeah, but I'm intrigued to just kind of see the back end of what's happening. I mean, the bottom 3 teams that currently have points, that doesn't include Sauber, they are currently the only team that has not scored points. Haas has 7 points, and then Williams and Alpine has 2 points. So I think that's really, really close. The one thing that kind of shook me was knowing that Aston Martin only has 44 points.
And I think the majority of those came from the first race.
Yeah. So that is definitely, a little uncomfortable because you're, smack dab in the middle.
Yikes.
But, yeah. So.
Well, this upcoming weekend we have off. There's no race this weekend, but then the week after that is the Canadian Grand Prix, and that takes place in Montreal, and it is sort of a street course, sort of not. It's kind of similar to
Melbourne?
Australia, where it's a park throughout the year, so the road doesn't really get used that much. If it is, it's like a biking.
It's not like a city street course.
Yeah. One thing you will notice,
wildlife.
Yes, we're gonna get some wildlife. We're gonna get some beavers. Last year there were some times.
Are you
where
sure it's beavers or not groundhogs? You said beavers like twice, and I feel like it's not beavers.
I guess we'll find out. It might be groundhogs.
I feel like you've been confidently saying that, but
aren't groundhogs like you can have as like a pet, right?
I don't
know.
No,
what are the ones I'm talking about? The spiky ones in the back. The tiny little ones.
Hedgehogs?
Okay, they both have hog at the end of the name.
I don't know a single person on this planet that is a groundhog.
There's definitely someone in this world that has a groundhog as a pet. Anyways, maybe it's a groundhog, maybe it's a beaver, maybe it's a hedgehog. I guess we'll find out when we get there. Beaver feels way more Canadian to me.
I just feel like a groundhog makes more sense than a beaver, but
could be a groundhog.
Yeah, we'll let you guys know.
Could be a hamster at this point.
I don't think so.
But this will actually be the 1-year anniversary of the first race that I watched live, so I'm very excited about that. Last year at the Canadian Grand Prix, we actually saw some mastery by Alex Albon in the Williams. He led a DRS train for a good 20 laps or so, and ended up coming like 7th place or something and getting like major points for Williams. And I think that this was the first race last year that they started to do really well, that it kind of kicked off their season for them. I'm hoping that they can do that again this year. I have faith that they can. I guess we'll have to wait and see, obviously. No one can tell the future. But, yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah, I think it's going to be fun. Very, very different than this weekend.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I'm happy after this doubleheader to have a little bit of a weekend break. But I like Canada. I feel like that was the one that I was, like, in and out of the living room because you had it on the TV for the first time.
Yeah.
So I feel like I didn't pay attention, but I definitely liked the vibe.
Good to know.
Yeah. All right.
All right. Make sure to follow us on all of our socials, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. That's all for today, guys.
Talk
Bye.
to you later.